The rain fell with peculiar persistence that October morning, as though the very heavens conspired to mirror the tumultuous state of affairs within the towering glass edifice of Thornfield Industries. Eleanor Marsh pressed her face closer to the grimy window of the downtown bus, watching droplets race each other down the surface while her reflection stared back, wan, determined, yet bearing the unmistakable marks of one who had known hardship intimately. At 26, Eleanor possessed that particular brand of quiet dignity that adversity often bestows upon those strong enough to bear it. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical knot, and though her clothes were worn, they were meticulously clean and pressed. She carried herself with an erectness of posture that spoke of pride, carefully maintained, despite circumstances that might have broken a lesser spirit. The bus lurched to a stop before the gleaming headquarters of one of the city's most formidable corporate empires. Eleanor gathered her worn leather satchel, a relic from better days, and stepped into the morning rain. The building before her rose like some modern Tower of Babel, its glass walls reflecting the grey sky in 1,000 fractured images. She had come here not by choice, but by necessity, driven by circumstances as relentless as the October wind that now whipped her modest coat about her ankles. Within the marble-clad lobby, Eleanor felt herself diminish beneath the soaring ceilings and the cool regard of security personnel whose uniforms likely cost more than her monthly wages would be. Yet she held her head high, approaching the reception desk with the measured step of one who refuses to be cowed by grandeur. "Eleanor Marsh," she announced to the impeccably groomed receptionist, "I have an appointment regarding the housekeeping position." The woman's eyes flickered over Eleanor's appearance with that particular species of assessment reserved for those seeking employment in service. "Take the service elevator to the 50th floor. Mrs. Fairfax will see you." The service elevator. How fitting, Eleanor thought with a bitter smile, that even the conveyances in this place should emphasize the distinctions of class. As the floors climbed past in silent succession, she reflected upon the series of misfortunes that had brought her to this point. The death of her father, a respected literature professor, had left debts that consumed their modest family home. Her mother's subsequent illness had drained what little remained, and now, with her mother residing in a care facility whose costs mounted daily, Eleanor found herself stripped of all but the most basic necessities. The elevator doors opened to reveal a corridor of austere efficiency. Mrs. Fairfax, the housekeeper, who would be Eleanor's immediate superior, proved to be a woman of middle years whose kind eyes belied the severity of her manner. She was neither harsh nor particularly warm, but possessed that quality of steady competence that Eleanor had learned to value above mere affability. "You come with excellent references," Mrs. Fairfax observed, reviewing the documents Eleanor had submitted. "Though I confess myself surprised to find someone of your evident education seeking such a position." Eleanor met her gaze steadily. "Circumstances, Mrs. Fairfax, are often more powerful than preferences. I require honest employment, and I am not above any work that is honorably performed. Indeed. Well, you should know that Mr. Rochester, that is, Mr. Edward Rochester, our president and CEO, maintains very particular standards. This penthouse suite serves not only as his office, but occasionally as his residence when business demands extend beyond conventional hours. Discretion is paramount, as is absolute reliability." The name Rochester stirred something in Eleanor's memory, fragments of newspaper articles and business journals that had occasionally crossed her path. Edward Rochester was something of a legend in corporate circles, known as much for his ruthless business acumen as for his reclusive nature. Rumors swirled about him like autumn leaves in a windstorm, that he was brilliant but temperamental, that he had built his empire through sheer force of will after some undefined tragedy in his past, that he trusted no one and suffered fools not at all. "I understand completely," Eleanor replied. "When would you require me to begin?" "Immediately, if you are able. Mr. Rochester returns from London this afternoon, and he is particular about finding his environment exactly as he prefers it. Eleanor spent the remainder of the morning learning the intricate requirements of her new position. The penthouse suite occupied the entirety of the 50th floor, a domain of leather and dark wood, of carefully controlled lighting and technology, so advanced it seemed almost mystical to one unaccustomed to such luxuries. Every surface must gleam, every book on the vast shelves must stand in perfect alignment, every piece of the priceless art collection must be free of the faintest trace of dust. Mrs. Fairfax proved a thorough instructor, detailing not only the mechanical aspects of the work, but the more subtle requirements of serving one whose temperament was, she hinted, somewhat volatile. "He is not unkind," she explained as they toured the sprawling space, "but he is a man who has known disappointment, and it has left him guarded. He prefers solitude to society, and when he must endure company, he does not suffer pretense gladly. Speak only when spoken to, perform your duties with quiet efficiency, and above all, do not attempt to engage him in conversation beyond what is strictly necessary." Eleanor nodded her understanding, though privately she wondered what species of disappointment could transform a man into such a creature of isolation. The penthouse itself told its own story, magnificent in its appointments, yet somehow cold, as though all the luxury in the world could not warm a space inhabited by one who had forgotten how to take pleasure in beauty. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the polished floors, Mrs. Fairfax glanced at her watch with evident anxiety. "He will arrive shortly. You would do well to make yourself scarce until tomorrow morning. He prefers not to encounter the staff during his first hours back from travel." Eleanor was gathering her things when the private elevator chimed its arrival. Mrs. Fairfax gestured urgently toward the service corridor, but it was too late. The doors slid open, and Eleanor found herself face to face with the enigma that was Edward Rochester. He was not what she had expected. Approaching perhaps 35, he possessed the kind of presence that seemed to charge the very air around him. His dark hair showed premature touches of silver at the temples, and his face, while undeniably handsome, bore lines that spoke of struggles weathered and battles fought. But it was his eyes that held her, dark, penetrating, filled with an intelligence that seemed to catalogue and assess everything they encountered. He paused in the doorway, his gaze fixed upon Eleanor with an intensity that made her acutely conscious of her simple dress and practical shoes. The silence stretched between them like a held breath, charged with an energy she could not name. "And you are..." His voice carried the cultured tones of expensive education, yet beneath its surface, courtesy lay something harder, more dangerous. "Eleanor Marsh, sir. I am the new housekeeping staff." "Yes." His eyes never left her face. "I trust Mrs. Fairfax has instructed you in your duties?" "She has, sir." "Excellent. Then you understand that I value competence above all other qualities in those who work for me." He moved past her toward his office, then paused. "Miss Marsh, you are not what I expected in a housekeeper." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her voice level. "I hope that will not prove a disadvantage, sir." Something flickered in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or amusement. "We shall see. Good evening, Miss Marsh." As the door closed behind him, Eleanor released a breath she had not realized she was holding. Mrs. Fairfax appeared at her elbow, her expression a mixture of concern and curiosity. "Well," she murmured, "that was unusual. In all my years here, I have never seen Mr. Rochester take such particular notice of a new employee." Eleanor said nothing, but as she gathered her things and prepared to leave, she found herself wondering about the man behind the closed office door. There had been something in his manner, not unkindness precisely, but a quality of watchful isolation that spoke of wounds not fully healed. The following morning dawned crisp and clear, the rain having washed the city to a crystalline brightness that made even the grimy bus windows seem almost clean. Eleanor arrived early, determined to establish herself as the model of reliability that Mrs. Fairfax had indicated Mr. Rochester required. The penthouse was silent when she entered, though she could see light beneath the door of what she had learned was his private study. He was already at work then, despite the early hour. She began her duties with quiet efficiency, moving through the spaces like a shadow, leaving order and cleanliness in her wake. It was while dusting the extensive library that she first encountered trouble. The volumes were arranged according to some system she could not immediately discern, not alphabetical, not chronological, but following some logic known only to their owner. She had lifted a particularly heavy tome to clean beneath it when disaster struck. The book slipped from her grasp, falling to the polished hardwood floor with a sound like thunder in the morning stillness. "What the devil?" The study door flew open, and Edward Rochester emerged like an avenging angel, his dark eyes blazing with irritation. He stopped short when he saw Eleanor kneeling to retrieve the fallen book, his expression shifting from anger to something more complex. "I'm terribly sorry, sir," Eleanor said, rising with the book cradled carefully in her hands. "It slipped. Carlyle's French Revolution," he observed, his tone unreadable. "Not light reading for a housekeeper." Eleanor felt her spine stiffen at the implied condescension. "I am familiar with Carlyle's work, sir. My father was a professor of literature." Rochester's eyebrows rose slightly. "Indeed. And what did your learned father think of Carlyle's rather dramatic interpretation of historical events?" The question was clearly meant as a test, a way of exposing her presumption. But Eleanor had spent too many evenings in her father's study, too many hours in passionate discussion of books and ideas to be intimidated by such tactics. "He admired Carlyle's passion while questioning his objectivity," she replied evenly. "He often said that Carlyle wrote history as though it were poetry, which makes for compelling reading but questionable scholarship." Something shifted in Rochester's expression. Surprise gave way to what might have been the beginning of respect. "Your father sounds like a wise man. Is he?" "Dead, sir. 3 years now." "I see. And your mother?" "In care. The expenses—" Eleanor stopped herself, realizing she was volunteering information he had not requested. Rochester studied her for a long moment, and Eleanor had the unsettling sensation of being catalogued, assessed, and filed away in some mental index of human complexity. "You may continue with your duties, Miss Marsh, but perhaps in future you might handle my books with rather more reverence." "Of course, sir." As he turned to go, Eleanor felt a sudden surge of irritation at his patronizing tone. "Mr. Rochester," he paused, clearly unaccustomed to being addressed by the hired help. "I handle all books with reverence, sir. They are, after all, the repositories of human thought and experience. That one happened to slip from my hands does not diminish my respect for its contents." The silence that followed was profound. Rochester turned slowly, his dark eyes fixed upon her face with an intensity that made her heart quicken despite herself. "Are you lecturing me, Miss Marsh?" Eleanor lifted her chin. "I am merely clarifying my position, sir. I would not wish there to be any misunderstanding about my attitude toward literature." For a moment, she thought she had gone too far. His expression was unreadable, and she braced herself for dismissal, or worse. Then unexpectedly, the corner of his mouth lifted in what might almost have been a smile. "How refreshing," he murmured. "Someone who dares to contradict Edward Rochester. Tell me, Miss Marsh, are you always so forthright with your employers?" "I am honest, sir, when honesty is called for." "And you believe it was called for just now?" Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "I believe that respect should flow in both directions, sir, regardless of the disparity in circumstances." The words hung in the air between them like a gauntlet thrown down. Eleanor realized she was trembling slightly, whether from anger or fear she could not say. She had need of this position desperately, yet something in his tone had sparked a rebellion she could not suppress. Rochester stepped closer, and she caught the scent of his cologne, something expensive and complex, like the man himself. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, almost conversational. "And if I were to tell you, Miss Marsh, that your services are no longer required, that your honesty has cost you this position?" Eleanor felt the world tilt slightly, but forced herself to remain steady. Then I would accept your decision, sir, and seek employment elsewhere. Just like that? What alternative would I have, sir? He was studying her again with that penetrating gaze, as though trying to solve some puzzle she presented. Most people in your position would apologize profusely, perhaps weep, certainly beg for another chance. I am not most people, sir. No, he said slowly. I am beginning to see that you are not. The tension stretched between them, charged with something Eleanor could not name. Then abruptly, Rochester stepped back. Continue with your duties, Miss Marsh. But understand this, I am a man who values competence and discretion above all else. Can you provide both? I can, sir. Even when your honesty conflicts with discretion? Eleanor considered this. I will perform my duties to the best of my ability, sir, but I will not compromise my integrity to do so. Rochester stared at her for a long moment, then threw back his head and laughed, a sound with little humor in it but genuine surprise. Extraordinary, he murmured. Absolutely extraordinary. Very well, Miss Marsh. We shall see how this experiment in mutual respect progresses. He disappeared into his study, leaving Eleanor standing alone in the library, her heart racing and her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the Carlyle volume. She had the distinct impression that she had just crossed some invisible line, entered into some unspoken compact whose terms she did not fully understand. As she carefully returned the book to its place on the shelf, she found herself wondering about the man who had just challenged and, seemingly, accepted her challenge in return. Edward Rochester was clearly accustomed to being obeyed without question, to having his word treated as law within his domain. Yet he had not dismissed her for her impertinence. Instead, he had seemed almost intrigued. The morning passed quietly after that, with Eleanor moving through her duties with particular care. She was conscious of his presence behind the closed study door, aware of the soft murmur of his voice as he conducted business via telephone. Once she heard him laugh, a different sound from his earlier bitter amusement, this one carrying genuine pleasure, and found herself wondering what could have provoked such a response. It was near noon when Mrs. Fairfax appeared, her usually composed demeanor showing signs of agitation. "My dear," she said without preamble, "what did you say to Mr. Rochester this morning?" Eleanor paused in her polishing of an already spotless coffee table. "We had a brief conversation about books, Mrs. Fairfax." "Why do you ask?" "Because he has just informed me that you are to be given additional responsibilities. You are to manage not only the cleaning of this suite, but also the organization of his personal library and correspondence. The pay increase is quite substantial." Eleanor stared at her in bewilderment. "I don't understand. I believed he might be displeased with my performance." Mrs. Fairfax's expression was curious. "On the contrary, he seems quite impressed. Though I confess myself at a loss to understand what could have occasioned such a rapid change in your circumstances." Eleanor said nothing, but privately she wondered if Edward Rochester was the sort of man who appreciated being stood up to, a possibility that both intrigued and alarmed her. She had met such men before, those who surrounded themselves with sycophants until they lost all appreciation for genuine interaction. But somehow she sensed that Rochester's motivations were more complex than simple boredom with flattery. The afternoon brought new challenges as Eleanor attempted to familiarize herself with the extensive library. The books were indeed arranged according to some personal system, and as she worked to understand its logic, she found herself forming an unexpected picture of their owner's mind. Here were the classics of literature arranged not by author but by theme, works dealing with redemption clustered together, explorations of moral ambiguity forming their own section, tales of isolation and recovery occupying an entire shelf. It was a library that spoke of a searching intellect, one that returned again and again to certain fundamental questions about human nature and moral responsibility. Eleanor found herself drawn into examining titles, discovering authors she had heard her father mention but never read, finding unexpected connections between disparate works. She was so absorbed in this intellectual archaeology that she failed to notice the study door opening, failed to register the soft footfalls on the thick carpet. It was only when Edward Rochester cleared his throat that she realized he had been watching her, probably for several minutes. "Finding anything of interest, Miss Marsh?" Eleanor straightened, conscious of having been caught in what might appear to be idleness. "I was attempting to understand your organizational system, sir. It's quite unique." Unique is a diplomatic way of putting it. Most people would simply say eccentric. He moved to stand beside her, and she was again struck by his commanding presence. But then, most people approach books as decoration rather than as living things. You don't arrange them for show, then? Hardly. Each of these volumes has earned its place through repeated reading, through the ways in which it has illuminated or challenged my thinking. They are arranged as they are because certain books converse with one another, create dialogues across centuries and cultures. Eleanor looked at the shelf she had been studying with new understanding. The theme is transformation, isn't it? The way people change or resist change when faced with crisis. Rochester's eyebrows rose. "Very good, Miss Marsh. Most people see only chaos where I see conversation. It's rather like a map of your intellectual journey, sir, the way you've wrestled with particular questions over time." He was quiet for a moment, and when Eleanor glanced at him, she saw something almost vulnerable in his expression. "You see a great deal, don't you?" "I see what interests me, sir, and books have always interested me greatly." "More than people?" The question was quietly asked, but somehow weighted with significance. Eleanor considered her answer carefully. "People are infinitely more complex than books, sir. But books can help us understand people, including ourselves. They offer a kind of honesty that social interaction often lacks, meaning that people dissemble while books tell truth, meaning that books reveal their authors' truths, even when the authors themselves might prefer to hide them. There's a vulnerability in publishing one's thoughts that makes for remarkable honesty." Rochester moved to another section of the library, running his finger along the spines of what Eleanor could see were volumes of poetry. "And do you find such vulnerability admirable?" "I find it necessary, sir. Without vulnerability, without the willingness to expose ourselves to potential judgment or ridicule, how can we ever truly connect with one another?" A dangerous philosophy, Miss Marsh. Vulnerability can be costly. There was something in his tone that made Eleanor study his profile carefully. He was looking at the books, but seeing, she suspected, something else entirely, some memory or experience that had taught him to equate openness with pain. "Perhaps, sir, but so can its absence. A life lived entirely behind defenses is hardly a life at all." He turned to face her then, and she was startled by the intensity of his gaze. "You speak as one who has experienced both conditions, Miss Marsh. Don't we all, sir? The question is which condition we ultimately choose. And which have you chosen?" Eleanor met his eyes steadily. "I prefer honesty to safety, sir, though I confess the preference has not always served me well." "No," he said quietly. "I imagine it has not." The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken understanding. Then Rochester seemed to shake himself from whatever reverie had claimed him. "I shall leave you to continue your work, Miss Marsh, but perhaps this evening, when your duties are complete, you might join me for dinner. I find myself curious about your thoughts on some of these volumes." Eleanor stared at him in surprise. "Sir, I hardly think, that is, it would not be appropriate." "Appropriate to whom, Miss Marsh? We are both adults, both lovers of literature. Where is the impropriety in a civilized discussion of books over a meal? The impropriety lies in the difference in our positions, sir. I am your employee, not your social equal." Rochester's expression hardened slightly. "I see. And this troubles you?" "It troubles me that you seem to forget it, sir." His laugh was harsh. "Forget it? Miss Marsh, I'm reminded of social distinctions every moment of every day. But I had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that within these walls, between two people who share certain intellectual interests, such distinctions might matter less." Eleanor felt herself wavering. The loneliness in his voice was unmistakable. and she recognized it because she had felt it herself, the isolation that comes from being surrounded by people who see only what they expect to see, who never truly engage with the person beneath the surface. I appreciate the invitation, sir, truly, but I think it would be unwise for both of us because neither of us can afford the complications that might arise from blurring the boundaries of our professional relationship. Rochester studied her for a long moment, and Eleanor had the uncomfortable sensation that he was seeing far more than she wished to reveal. Very well, Miss Marsh. Your wisdom is noted, if not entirely appreciated. But tell me, do you never allow yourself any deviation from the path of absolute propriety? When the stakes are high enough, sir, propriety becomes a luxury I cannot afford. And what makes you think the stakes are high in this case? Eleanor met his gaze directly. Because, sir, I suspect we are both people who feel things deeply, and such people rarely manage to keep their emotions safely contained when they spend time in close proximity. The words hung in the air between them, an admission more honest than Eleanor had intended. Rochester's expression shifted, surprise giving way to something more complex, recognition perhaps, or a kind of reluctant respect. You are a remarkably perceptive woman, Miss Marsh. I am a woman who knows herself, sir, and who recognizes similar qualities in others. And what qualities do you recognize in me? Eleanor hesitated, then decided that having come this far, she might as well speak the whole truth. Loneliness, sir. Intelligence carefully guarded behind walls of authority and social position. A hunger for genuine connection that conflicts with an equally strong need for self-protection. Rochester was very still, and for a moment Eleanor feared she had gone too far. Then he nodded slowly. A devastating assessment, Miss Marsh, and uncomfortably accurate. I did not mean to presume, sir. On the contrary, you meant precisely to presume. The question is whether your presumption is justified by its accuracy. Eleanor said nothing, sensing that they had reached some crucial juncture whose outcome she could not predict. Very well, Rochester said finally. We shall maintain the boundaries you believe necessary. But understand this, Miss Marsh. I am not accustomed to being understood so clearly. It is both refreshing and unsettling. I understand, sir. Do you? I wonder. He moved toward his study, then paused. Tell me, Miss Marsh, are you happy with the life you have chosen? The question caught her off guard. Happy, sir? Content. Satisfied. At peace with your circumstances and choices. Eleanor considered this. I am resigned to necessity, sir. Happiness is a luxury I have not lately been able to afford. And yet you speak of choosing honesty over safety, vulnerability over protection. Those sound like choices made by someone who still believes happiness might be possible. Hope is hard to kill entirely, sir, even when experience suggests it might be wiser to do so. Rochester smiled then, and for the first time since she had met him, the expression seemed entirely genuine. Indeed, Miss Marsh, hope is the most stubborn of human characteristics. Babe, as he disappeared into his study, Eleanor found herself standing alone in the library, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of centuries, yet feeling suddenly unmoored. The conversation had revealed more about both of them than was comfortable, had opened doors she had intended to keep firmly closed. She returned to her work with less than her usual focus, her mind returning again and again to the expression in Edward Rochester's eyes, the mixture of intelligence and pain, of longing and carefully maintained distance. He was a man who had learned to expect disappointment, she realized, yet who had not entirely surrendered his capacity for hope. As the afternoon waned and shadows began to lengthen across the polished floors, Eleanor found herself wondering what experiences had shaped him, what losses had taught him to guard his heart so carefully. She recognized the signs because she bore them herself, the hypervigilance of one who had learned that trust was a dangerous luxury, the careful rationing of emotional investment that came from having been wounded by those who should have been safe. Yet beneath his guardedness, she had sensed something else, a kind of restless energy, an intelligence-seeking engagement, a spirit not yet entirely resigned to solitude. It was this combination that made him dangerous to her peace of mind. This suggestion that beneath the wealthy CEO lay a man capable of understanding her own complex relationship with vulnerability and connection. As she prepared to leave for the day, Eleanor caught herself glancing toward the closed study door, wondering what Edward Rochester was thinking, whether their conversation had affected him as profoundly as it had her. The thought troubled her, because it suggested an investment in his inner life that went well beyond the boundaries of professional concern. She gathered her things and made her way to the service elevator, determinedly pushing such thoughts aside. She was a woman who prided herself on good judgment, on the ability to recognize danger and respond accordingly. Edward Rochester represented a threat to the careful equilibrium she had constructed, not because he was a bad man, but because he was the sort of man who could make her forget why walls were necessary, why keeping one's heart safely guarded was sometimes the only path to survival. As the elevator descended toward the lobby, Eleanor made herself a promise. She would perform her duties with exemplary competence, would treat her employer with appropriate respect, and would not allow herself to be drawn into the kind of personal connection that could only end in complications neither of them could afford. It was a sensible resolution, born of hard-won wisdom about the costs of emotional vulnerability. Yet even as she made this vow, Eleanor found herself looking forward to tomorrow morning, to the moment when she would again enter Edward Rochester's domain and resume their complex dance of approach and avoidance, understanding and resistance. The anticipation troubled her because it suggested that despite her resolutions, the damage might already be done. That somewhere in the space between his surprising respect for her honesty and her growing recognition of his essential loneliness, the boundaries she was so determined to maintain had already begun to blur. The following weeks established a peculiar rhythm between Eleanor and Edward Rochester, one that resembled nothing so much as an intricate chess match played out across the polished surfaces of the penthouse suite. Each morning, she would arrive to find evidence of his solitary occupancy. Coffee cups left on side tables, books pulled from their carefully organized shelves and left open to marked passages. The faint, lingering scent of his cologne in rooms where he had passed the night working. Eleanor found herself studying these traces with an anthropologist's attention to detail, piecing together fragments of his nocturnal habits. He read voraciously, she discovered, but with a restless energy that suggested he was searching for something specific, answers to questions she could only guess at. Philosophy texts lay open beside business journals. Poetry volumes marked with careful annotations rested atop legal documents. It was the intellectual landscape of a man whose mind refused to be confined to the narrow channels of commerce, despite his evident success in that realm. On the third Tuesday of her employment, Eleanor arrived to find the library in a state of unusual disarray. Books lay scattered across the vast Persian carpet, their pages spread open as though Rochester had been conducting some desperate search through their contents. She paused in the doorway, uncertain whether to proceed or retreat, when his voice emerged from behind the towering mahogany desk. "Come in, Miss Marsh. I'm in need of your particular expertise." She found him seated amid the chaos, his usually immaculate appearance showing signs of a sleepless night. His shirt was wrinkled, his dark hair disheveled, and there was a quality of barely contained energy about him that made the air seem charged with electricity. "Sir, I am preparing for a board meeting this afternoon," he said without looking up from the document spread before him. "A hostile takeover attempt that threatens to destroy everything I have built. The opposing counsel has chosen to base their argument on questions of moral authority, corporate ethics, the responsibilities of power." Eleanor began gathering the scattered books, noting their titles. Mill's On Liberty, Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, Adam Smith's Theory of Moral Sentiments. Heavy ammunition for a business battle. "They seek to paint me as a robber baron," Rochester continued, his voice carrying a bitter edge. "A man who has accumulated wealth without regard for the human cost. They are not entirely wrong. Eleanor paused in her collecting, a volume of Marcus Aurelius in her hands. "Sir, I have made difficult choices, Miss Marsh. Closed factories, eliminated jobs, pursued profits with single-minded determination, all in service of building something larger, something that could provide employment and prosperity for thousands. But the individual costs..." He trailed off, running his hands through his hair. "You seek philosophical justification for pragmatic necessities." Rochester looked up at her sharply. "I seek understanding of whether a man can be both successful and moral, Miss Marsh, whether the greater good can excuse the smaller cruelties." Eleanor set down the book she had gathered and considered her words carefully. "Perhaps, sir, the question is not whether your actions were entirely moral, but whether they were entirely necessary." "Aye? Meaning?" "Meaning that true moral authority might lie not in the perfection of one's past choices, but in the honesty with which one examines them and the wisdom one gains from that examination." Rochester was silent for a long moment, studying her with that penetrating gaze she had come to recognize. "You would have me confess my sins to the board of directors? I would have you speak truthfully about the complexities of leadership, sir, about the weight of decisions that affect thousands of lives, and the humility that should accompany such responsibility." Humility. He spoke the word as though it were foreign to him, not a quality generally associated with corporate success. "Perhaps that is why so many corporate leaders fail in the end, sir. They mistake arrogance for strength, never learning that true authority rests on the acknowledgement of one's limitations and mistakes." Rochester stood abruptly, moving to the windows that overlooked the city far below. "You speak as though you have experience with such matters, Miss Marsh." "I have experience with the consequences of other people's decisions, sir. I have seen what happens to those who suffer when leaders choose expedience over compassion." "And you condemn such leaders?" Eleanor joined him at the window, maintaining a careful distance, but allowing herself to study his profile in the morning light. "I pity them, sir, because in choosing to see others as expendable, they make themselves incapable of the very connections that might redeem their choices." "Redemption," he murmured, "another concept foreign to the business world." "Not foreign, sir, simply ignored, but perhaps that is what your opponents sense, not the absence of morality in your actions, but the presence of regret, the suggestion that you are capable of growth, of learning from your mistakes. That makes you dangerous to them, because it makes you human." Rochester turned to face her fully, and Eleanor was startled by the intensity of his expression. "You have a remarkable ability, Miss Marsh, to find hope in the darkest of circumstances." "I have a remarkable ability to survive them, sir. Hope is simply the tool I use to do so." The silence that followed was profound, charged with unspoken understanding. Then Rochester moved away from the window, his manner becoming brisk and businesslike once more. "Thank you for your consultation, Miss Marsh. I believe I understand now how to approach this afternoon's proceedings." Eleanor nodded and resumed gathering the scattered books, but she was acutely aware of his presence as he moved about the room, straightening his appearance and gathering his materials for the day ahead. There was something different in his manner, a quality of resolved energy that had replaced the earlier desperation. As he prepared to leave, he paused beside her. "Miss Marsh, I wonder if you might remain this evening after your usual hours. I suspect I shall return from today's battles in need of conversation with someone who understands the complexities of moral choice." Eleanor felt her carefully maintained equilibrium waver. "Sir, I have explained my feelings about..." "This is not a social invitation, Miss Marsh. It is a request for professional consultation. I find that your perspective on ethical matters is illuminating. I am prepared to compensate you accordingly for the additional time." The careful formality of his phrasing did nothing to disguise the underlying request. He needed her company, her understanding, her particular brand of honest engagement. Eleanor recognized the danger in agreeing, yet she found herself unable to refuse. "Very well, sir. I shall remain until you return." "Excellent. And Miss Marsh?" "Yes, sir. Thank you for helping me remember that strength and vulnerability need not be mutually exclusive." After he left, Eleanor found herself unable to concentrate on her usual duties. The morning's conversation had revealed layers of complexity in Edward Rochester that both intrigued and alarmed her. She had glimpsed the man beneath the corporate mask, someone who struggled with the moral implications of his choices, who sought not just success, but meaning, who carried the weight of his decisions like a physical burden. It was this very humanity that made him dangerous to her peace of mind. Eleanor had learned to navigate the world by maintaining careful emotional distance, by seeing people as they chose to present themselves rather than as they truly were. But Rochester seemed incapable of maintaining such facades for long. His honesty about his struggles, his genuine interest in her perspective, his obvious loneliness, all combined to create exactly the kind of connection she had spent years learning to avoid. The day passed with unusual slowness, each hour marked by Eleanor's growing apprehension about the evening ahead. She told herself that their arrangement was purely professional, that Rochester's interest in her opinions was merely the hunger of an isolated man for intelligent conversation. Yet she could not entirely suppress the memory of the way he had looked at her that morning, with a recognition that went beyond intellectual appreciation, a sense of finding in her something he had not known he was seeking. As evening approached, Eleanor found herself paying unusual attention to her appearance. She told herself it was merely a matter of professional presentation, yet she could not entirely ignore the way she lingered over the choice of which worn but well-maintained dress to wear, the extra care she took with her hair. Such vanity was unlike her, and its very presence served as a warning of how dangerously her feelings were developing. Rochester returned as darkness was settling over the city, his usual commanding presence somehow heightened by the energy of recent victory. Eleanor could see it in his bearing as he entered, the satisfaction of battles fought and won, the confidence that came from having faced down his opponents and emerged triumphant. "Miss Marsh," he said without preamble, "you may be pleased to know that your counsel proved invaluable. The board not only rejected the takeover attempt, but commended my leadership approach. It seems that honesty about one's limitations is indeed a form of strength." "I am glad to hear it, sir." "Are you?" "I confess myself curious about your investment in my success." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I am invested in the success of honest dealing, sir. When good judgment prevails over expedience, everyone benefits." Rochester smiled, and Eleanor was struck again by how the expression transformed his entire countenance. "Diplomatically put, Miss Marsh, but I think we both know that your interest in my welfare extends beyond abstract principles." The directness of his observation left Eleanor momentarily speechless. She had prided herself on maintaining professional boundaries, yet apparently her concern for his struggles had been more transparent than she realized. "Sir, please, don't retreat into formality now, not when we have been so honest with each other." He moved closer, and Eleanor caught again the scent of his cologne, felt again the peculiar charge that seemed to emanate from his presence. "I find myself curious about you, Miss Marsh, about the experiences that have shaped your particular wisdom, the losses that have taught you to find strength in vulnerability." "My experiences are hardly unique, sir. Most people learn to adapt to circumstances beyond their control. Most people learn to survive, yes, but you have learned something more. How to transform necessity into choice, how to find dignity in the most reduced circumstances. That suggests a strength of character that intrigues me greatly." Eleanor took a careful step backward, trying to restore some distance between them. "Strength of character is often simply the absence of alternatives, sir." "Is it? Or is it the decision to maintain one's integrity, regardless of the cost?" He followed her movement, not aggressively, but with the persistence of someone accustomed to getting answers to his questions. "Tell me, Miss Marsh, what brought you to my employ? What circumstances reduced a professor's daughter to cleaning houses for wealthy men?" The question struck closer to home than Eleanor was prepared for. She felt her carefully maintained composure waver, felt the old pain stir beneath the surface of her professional calm. That is hardly relevant to our current arrangement, sir. Isn't it? I think our current arrangement is based precisely on our mutual recognition of each other's own complications. You see through my defenses because you understand the need for them. I see through yours for the same reason. Eleanor turned away from him, moving toward the windows where the city lights twinkled like earthbound stars. You presume a great deal, sir. I presume nothing. I observe, and I draw conclusions based on evidence. He appeared beside her, his reflection ghost-like in the dark glass. You carry yourself like someone who has known better days. You speak like someone educated beyond your current station. You respond to literature and philosophy with the familiarity of long acquaintance. And beneath your professional competence, there is a quality of grief, carefully contained but never entirely absent. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, fighting against the urge to simply tell him everything about her father's death, her mother's illness, the crushing weight of medical bills and funeral expenses that had consumed everything she had thought secure, about the gradual realization that her education and breeding meant nothing in the face of economic necessity, that pride was indeed a luxury she could not afford. My circumstances are my own concern, sir. Of course they are. But they have made you who you are, and who you are matters to me. The quiet intensity of his words made Eleanor open her eyes, meet his gaze in the darkened window. What she saw there made her breath catch, not pity, which she would have resented, but recognition, understanding, and something else that she dared not name. Sir, this conversation is inappropriate. Is it? We are two adults discussing the forces that have shaped our lives. Where is the impropriety in that? The impropriety lies in the growing intimacy of our exchanges. You are my employer, I am your employee, and these personal revelations serve no professional purpose. Rochester was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a note of sadness. You are right, of course, but I find myself reluctant to retreat to the safety of purely professional interaction. Reluctance does not alter necessity, sir. No, it does not. He moved away from the window, and Eleanor felt both relief and an unexpected sense of loss at his withdrawal. Very well, Miss Marsh, we shall maintain the boundaries you believe essential. But answer me one question, and I shall trouble you no further with personal inquiries. Eleanor turned to face him, seeing in his expression a vulnerability that made her heart ache. What question, sir? Are you content with a life of such careful limitations? Does it not exhaust you, this constant vigilance against connection? The question pierced through her defenses with surgical precision. Eleanor felt tears threaten, felt the weight of years spent in careful isolation, of connections refused and possibilities denied in service of emotional survival. Exhaustion is preferable to devastation, sir. Is it? Or have you simply forgotten that some connections might be worth the risk of pain? Eleanor met his gaze steadily, drawing on reserves of strength she had not known she possessed. I have forgotten nothing, sir. I simply choose to learn from experience rather than repeat past mistakes. And what mistakes were those, Miss Marsh? The mistake of believing that understanding creates obligation, sir. That shared recognition of pain or loneliness must necessarily lead to attempts at comfort. That two people who see each other clearly are somehow destined for deeper connection. Rochester's expression shifted, surprise giving way to something like admiration. You see very clearly indeed, Miss Marsh. Clear enough to recognize the path we are traveling, sir, and wise enough to step off it before we reach a destination neither of us can afford. And if I were to tell you that I believe we might both afford more than we think. Eleanor felt her resolve waver, felt the treacherous hope she had worked so hard to suppress stir to life in her chest. Then I would tell you that you are a man accustomed to getting what he wants, sir, and therefore perhaps not the best judge of what others can afford to give. The words hung between them like a barrier suddenly erected, and Eleanor saw Rochester absorb their implications with the quick intelligence she had come to expect from him. His expression closed slightly, the vulnerability disappearing behind walls of careful control. I see. You believe I would simply take what I wanted, regardless of the cost to you. I believe you are a man who has learned to see the world in terms of acquisition and possession, sir. And I am a woman who has learned that she cannot afford to be acquired or possessed by anyone, not even willingly. The question was quietly asked, but Eleanor heard in it depths of meaning that made her tremble. Especially not willingly, sir, because willing surrender is the most dangerous kind. It makes one complicit in one's own destruction. Rochester stared at her for a long moment, and Eleanor had the sense of being evaluated according to criteria she could not guess at. Then unexpectedly he smiled, not the bitter expression she had seen before, but something genuine and almost admiring. You are a formidable woman, Miss Marsh. I begin to understand why fate brought you to my door. Fate, sir. Necessity, then, if you prefer. The practical forces that govern our lives and arrange our encounters according to logic we rarely understand at the time. Eleanor felt herself on dangerous ground again, felt the conversation moving toward territories she was determined to avoid. I should prepare to leave, sir. The hour grows late. Of course. But before you go, allow me to say this. I respect your position, Miss Marsh. Your insistence on appropriate boundaries, your refusal to be drawn into complications that might compromise your security or your integrity. It is admirable, if somewhat frustrating. Frustrating, sir, because it means that I must content myself with your professional excellence and the occasional glimpse of your remarkable mind when I find myself increasingly curious about the woman behind both. Eleanor gathered her things with hands that trembled slightly, too aware of the weight of his gaze upon her. Good evening, sir. Good evening, Miss Marsh. And thank you for your counsel today, for your honesty this evening, and for the reminder that some treasures are too valuable to be carelessly handled. As Eleanor made her way to the elevator, she carried with her the memory of his final words, the suggestion that he saw her as something precious, something worthy of careful handling. It was exactly the kind of recognition she had learned to distrust, yet she found herself treasuring it despite her better judgment. The days that followed established a new equilibrium between them, one that acknowledged both the attraction they felt and the impossibility of acting upon it. Rochester became scrupulously professional in his interactions with her, yet Eleanor was aware of his attention in ways that made her skin prickle with awareness. He would watch her as she moved through her duties, his dark eyes following her with an intensity that made her acutely conscious of every gesture, every word. For her part, Eleanor found herself hyper-aware of his moods, his habits, the subtle changes in his demeanor that indicated the pressures he faced in his business dealings. She began to anticipate his needs in ways that went beyond mere professional competence, ensuring his coffee was exactly as he preferred it during stressful periods, leaving books she thought might interest him in strategic locations, managing his environment to create the kind of peaceful efficiency that allowed his restless energy to find productive outlets. It was a dance of approach and avoidance, of service and attention that carried emotional undertones neither acknowledged aloud. Eleanor told herself it was simply a matter of professional excellence, of taking pride in her work and performing her duties with exceptional skill. Yet she could not entirely ignore the satisfaction she felt when she saw Rochester relax slightly in her presence, the way his harsh expression would soften when he encountered some small service she had provided without being asked. 3 weeks into this new arrangement, Mrs. Fairfax approached Eleanor with an expression of puzzled concern. "My dear," she said without preamble, "I feel I must speak with you about your relationship with Mr. Rochester." Eleanor felt her heart skip. "Mrs. Fairfax? He has been asking questions about you, about your background, your family circumstances, your previous employment. Such inquiries are unusual for him." Eleanor set down the silver she had been polishing, her hands suddenly unsteady. "What sort of questions?" "Personal ones, my dear. The sort that suggest an interest that goes beyond professional evaluation. I thought you should be aware, should you wish to clarify the nature of your position here." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, processing this information and its implications. "Has he asked you to investigate me, Mrs. Fairfax?" "Not in so many words, but he has made it clear that he would welcome any information I might provide. I have not done so, of course. Your privacy is your own. But I thought you should know that his interest in your welfare appears to be evolving." That evening, as Eleanor prepared to leave, she found Rochester waiting by the elevator, his expression uncharacteristically hesitant. "Miss Marsh, might I have a word?" Eleanor felt her carefully maintained composure threaten to desert her. "Of course, sir. I understand that Mrs. Fairfax has spoken with you about my inquiries regarding your background." "She has, sir. I hope you will not think ill of my curiosity. It is simply that I find myself concerned about your circumstances and curious whether there might be ways in which your situation could be improved." Eleanor studied his face, seeing there a mixture of genuine concern and something else, a kind of protective instinct that both warmed and alarmed her. "I appreciate your concern, sir, but my circumstances are adequate to my needs." "Are they? Because I have reason to believe otherwise." Eleanor felt her blood chill. "Sir, I have made certain investigations, Miss Marsh, discreet ones but thorough. I know about your mother's condition, about the costs of her care, about the debts that brought you to your current reduced circumstances." Eleanor felt the world tilt slightly around her. "You had no right. I had every right to investigate the background of someone working in such close proximity to my private affairs. But that is not why I did so." "Then why?" Rochester moved closer, and Eleanor saw in his expression an intensity that made her pulse quicken despite her anger at his presumption. "Because I find myself unable to bear the thought of your struggling unnecessarily when I have the means to alleviate your burdens." "Sir, I cannot accept." "I am not offering charity, Miss Marsh. I am offering opportunity. A position that would utilize your intelligence and education more fully, with compensation commensurate with your actual abilities rather than your current circumstances." Eleanor stared at him, seeing the offer for what it was, not mere professional advancement, but a form of rescue that would eliminate the financial pressures that constrained her life, that would restore her to something approaching the security she had lost. It was exactly what she needed, exactly what she had hoped for without daring to expect, and it was absolutely impossible to accept. "I am grateful for your consideration, sir, but I must decline." Rochester's expression shifted to one of genuine bewilderment. "Decline? Miss Marsh, this position would triple your current salary, provide comprehensive benefits, ensure your mother's care without financial strain to yourself. Why would you possibly refuse such an opportunity?" Eleanor met his gaze steadily, drawing on reserves of strength she had not known she possessed. "Because accepting it would make me your debtor, sir. And debtors, even willing ones, are not free to maintain the boundaries that protect their integrity." Understanding dawned in Rochester's eyes, followed by something that might have been respect. "I see. You believe my offer comes with expectations." "I believe your offer comes from genuine kindness, sir, but I also believe that kindness, however well-intentioned, creates obligations that I am not prepared to assume." Rochester was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a note of sadness that made Eleanor's heart ache. "You have an extraordinary capacity for self-protection, Miss Marsh. I wonder if you have ever allowed yourself to accept help from anyone." "When I was certain, the help came without conditions, sir. But such certainty is rare, and you cannot find such certainty with me." Eleanor felt tears threaten, felt the weight of years spent in careful isolation, of opportunities refused and connections denied in service of emotional survival. "I cannot find such certainty with anyone, sir. Experience has taught me that all help comes with a price, and I have learned to be very careful about prices I cannot afford to pay." Rochester stared at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Very well, Miss Marsh. Your position shall remain as it is, and I shall trouble you no further with offers of advancement. But understand this, my concern for your welfare is not contingent upon your acceptance of my help. It exists independently of any benefit to myself. Eleanor felt something break inside her chest, some carefully maintained wall cracking under the pressure of his unexpected understanding. "Sir, Good evening, Miss Marsh. I shall see you tomorrow." Uday, as the elevator doors closed between them, Eleanor found herself leaning against the wall for support, overwhelmed by the realization of what she had just refused and why. Edward Rochester had offered her exactly what she needed to restore her life to security and dignity, and she had refused because accepting would have made her vulnerable to him in ways that terrified her more than poverty ever could. Because somewhere in the space between his surprising respect for her honesty and her growing recognition of his essential loneliness, the boundaries she was so determined to maintain had not merely begun to blur, they had begun to matter less than the man who stood on the other side of them, offering her everything she needed, except the one thing she dared not want, the freedom to love him without fear of the consequences. The winter months that followed brought with them a peculiar kind of torment for Eleanor, one born not of hardship, but of proximity to everything she had trained herself to resist. Edward Rochester, true to his word, made no further offers of advancement or assistance, yet his presence in her daily life became both more distant and more intimate, a contradiction that left her in a constant state of emotional vigilance. He had retreated behind walls of professional courtesy, addressing her with the same formal politeness he might show any competent employee. Yet Eleanor was acutely aware of his attention, of the way his eyes would follow her movements when he thought she was unaware, of the careful modulation in his voice that suggested emotions held deliberately in check. It was as though they had agreed to perform an elaborate theatrical piece, in which both acknowledged the fiction of their roles, while being moved, despite themselves, by the underlying truth of their feelings. The penthouse itself seemed to reflect this tension. Eleanor found herself paying obsessive attention to details that had never before concerned her, ensuring that every surface gleamed with particular brilliance, that every book stood in perfect alignment, that the very air seemed to hum with the kind of efficiency that might serve as a bulwark against the chaos of unexamined emotions. She threw herself into her work with an intensity that bordered on desperation, as though physical perfection in her environment might somehow impose order on the increasingly complicated landscape of her inner life. Rochester, for his part, seemed to have channeled his restless energy into an even more punishing schedule of business activities. Eleanor would arrive each morning to find evidence of his nocturnal labors, contracts spread across every available surface, coffee cups left cold and untouched, the peculiar stillness that follows intense mental exertion. He was driving himself with the kind of relentless focus that suggested he too was seeking refuge from thoughts that refused to be controlled through mere force of will. It was on a particularly bitter February morning that the careful equilibrium they had maintained was finally shattered. Eleanor arrived to find the penthouse in darkness, unusual for a man whose habits she had come to know with almost painful intimacy. She moved through her morning routine with growing unease, noting signs of disturbance that spoke of more than mere late-night work. Papers scattered across the floor, a crystal decanter left open on the side table, the lingering scent of whiskey that suggested Rochester had sought solace in substances rather than sleep. She found him in the library, seated in the leather chair before the windows, still wearing the previous day's clothes and staring out at the grey winter sky, with an expression of such profound desolation that Eleanor felt her breath catch in her throat. He appeared unaware of her presence, lost in some internal landscape of pain that made her own carefully guarded sorrows seem pale by comparison. "Sir?" Her voice emerged as barely more than a whisper, yet Rochester turned toward her with the slow, deliberate movement of someone returning from a great distance. "Miss Marsh." His voice was hoarse, whether from alcohol or emotion she could not determine. "I did not hear you arrive." Eleanor moved closer, noting the lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes, the pallor that spoke of a sleepless night spent in the company of demons she could only guess at. "Sir, are you quite well?" Rochester laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Well? No, Miss Marsh, I am decidedly unwell. I am a man who has spent the night confronting the accumulated failures of his existence, and I find the inventory disheartening." Eleanor felt her professional detachment crumble in the face of his obvious pain. Against every instinct of self-preservation, she found herself moving closer, drawn by an impulse to comfort that she had spent months learning to suppress. "What has happened, sir?" "Nothing has happened. That is precisely the problem." Rochester rose from his chair with unsteady movement, and Eleanor caught the scent of whiskey more strongly now. "I have spent 20 years building an empire, Miss Marsh. 20 years, accumulating wealth and power and influence. And for what? To sit alone in a tower of my own construction, surrounded by beautiful objects and empty of any connection that might give meaning to my accomplishments?" Eleanor felt her heart contract with sympathy, recognizing in his words the echo of her own carefully hidden despair. "Sir, perhaps you should rest." "Rest?" Rochester moved to the windows, pressing his palm against the cold glass. "How does one rest when sleep brings only dreams of what might have been, when every quiet moment is filled with the recognition of opportunities squandered, connections refused, the slow calcification of a heart that once knew how to hope?" Eleanor stood frozen, torn between the desire to comfort him and the knowledge that any attempt to do so would shatter the boundaries she had worked so hard to maintain. Yet as she watched him struggle with a pain that mirrored her own, she found those boundaries beginning to seem less like protection and more like prison walls. "Sir, whatever has brought this on, you, Miss Marsh." Rochester turned from the window to face her, and Eleanor saw in his eyes a raw honesty that made her feel suddenly exposed. "You have brought this on. Your presence in my life has forced me to confront the emptiness of my existence, the way I have chosen safety over connection, control over vulnerability." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. "Sir, I never intended—" "Of course you did not intend it. You intended nothing more than to perform your duties with competence and maintain appropriate professional boundaries. But your very presence, your particular combination of strength and grace, your refusal to be impressed by wealth or intimidated by authority, all of this has served as a mirror in which I see myself too clearly." Eleanor took a step backward, feeling the solid weight of the door behind her like a promise of escape. "Mr. Rochester, this conversation is inappropriate." "Inappropriate?" His laugh was harsh. "Miss Marsh, we passed the boundaries of appropriateness months ago. The moment you dared to contradict me, to challenge my assumptions, to see through the armor I have so carefully constructed, that was the moment we stepped beyond the safe confines of employer and employee into something far more dangerous." Eleanor felt her carefully maintained composure begin to crack. "I have done nothing to encourage. You have done everything to encourage it, simply by being who you are. By refusing my offers of advancement, by maintaining your integrity in the face of financial necessity, by showing me that it is possible to remain authentic even in the most reduced circumstances." Rochester moved closer, and Eleanor found herself trapped between his approaching figure and the door at her back. "You have shown me what I might have been, Miss Marsh, if I had possessed half your courage." Eleanor pressed herself against the door, feeling the cool wood through the fabric of her dress. "Sir, you must not speak this way." "Must not? And why must I not speak the truth?" "Because it makes you uncomfortable. Because it threatens the careful distance you have maintained between us. Because it forces you to acknowledge what we both know, but dare not name." Eleanor met his eyes, seeing there a desperation that made her own fears seem suddenly selfish. "Because neither of us can afford the consequences of such truth, sir." "Cannot afford them? Miss Marsh, I am beginning to think we cannot afford their absence." Rochester stopped just short of touching her, his presence overwhelming in the confined space between door and bookshelf. I have spent months watching you, admiring your strength, your intelligence, your refusal to compromise your principles for comfort or advancement. And in watching you, I have come to understand that I have been living only half a life, all achievement and no joy, all accumulation and no satisfaction. Eleanor closed her eyes, feeling the weight of years of careful self-protection warring with the treacherous hope that his words awakened in her chest. "What would you have me say, sir? That I have not noticed your qualities, that I have not felt the pull of connection despite my better judgment? That would be dishonest, and we have always been honest with each other." "Then be honest now. Tell me what you feel when you look at me." Eleanor opened her eyes, meeting his gaze with the kind of directness that had characterized all their interactions. "I feel recognition, sir. The dangerous recognition of finding in another person the very qualities I most value and least trust myself to handle wisely." "And what qualities are those?" "Intelligence without arrogance, strength tempered by vulnerability, the capacity for genuine feeling despite the armor of success and authority." Eleanor felt tears threaten, felt the careful walls of her emotional defenses beginning to crumble. "I see in you the man I might have loved, sir, if I were the woman I once hoped to become." Rochester stared at her for a long moment, and Eleanor saw her own pain reflected in his eyes. "Might have loved. Miss Marsh, are you telling me that love is a luxury relegated to the past tense, that we are both too damaged, too careful, too afraid to risk the kind of connection that might redeem all our accumulated sorrows?" Eleanor felt something break inside her chest, some final barrier giving way under the pressure of his understanding. "I am telling you that I am terrified, sir. Terrified of wanting something I cannot have, of risking everything I have left for the possibility of something I dare not hope for." "And what is it you dare not hope for?" Eleanor met his eyes, and in that moment, all her careful defenses finally crumbled. "To be loved for who I am, rather than what I can provide. To find in another person the kind of understanding that makes solitude unbearable. To build something together that is larger and more meaningful than either of us could create alone." Rochester reached toward her then, his hand stopping just short of touching her face. "And if I were to tell you that such hope need not be relegated to the conditional, that what you describe is precisely what I find myself wanting, despite all my fears and reservations." Eleanor felt her breath catch, felt the weight of possibility settling around them like a change in atmospheric pressure. "Then I would tell you that wanting and having are very different things, sir. That people in our circumstances must be very careful about the distance between desire and reality." "Our circumstances?" "The distance between wealth and poverty, sir. Between employer and employee, between a man accustomed to having his desires satisfied and a woman who has learned that her desires are luxuries she cannot afford." Rochester's hand finally made contact with her cheek, and Eleanor felt her carefully maintained composure dissolve at the gentle touch. "And if those circumstances were to change, if the boundaries that separate us could be transcended rather than simply ignored?" Eleanor leaned into his touch despite herself, feeling the warmth of his palm against her skin like a benediction. "How could they be transcended, sir? The facts of our positions cannot be altered by desire alone." Cannot they? Miss Marsh, Eleanor? What if I were to tell you that I no longer wish to be your employer? That I wish instead to be your partner, your equal, your companion in building something that belongs to both of us rather than either alone?" Eleanor felt her heart stop, felt the world tilt on its axis around the possibility contained in his words. "What are you saying, sir?" "I am saying that I love you, Eleanor Marsh. I'm saying that your strength and integrity and stubborn refusal to be impressed by material advantages have shown me what my life has been missing. I'm saying that I want to spend whatever years remain to me learning to deserve the kind of love you might offer if you could bring yourself to trust that such an offering would be treasured rather than exploited." Eleanor stared at him, seeing in his expression a vulnerability that matched her own, a hope that had been carefully hidden beneath layers of professional distance and emotional armor. Edward, will you consider it, not as my employee accepting an offer from her employer, but as a woman considering the proposal of a man who has come to understand that all his achievements mean nothing without someone to share them with? Eleanor felt tears spill over, felt the weight of years of careful solitude and emotional vigilance finally lifting from her shoulders. I am terrified of the risk, Edward. Terrified of hoping for something so beautiful that its loss would destroy what little strength I have left. Then we shall be terrified together, Rochester said softly, his thumb tracing the path of her tears. We shall risk everything together, and perhaps in doing so, we shall discover that we are both stronger than we believed possible. Eleanor looked into his eyes and saw there the reflection of her own desperate hope, her own carefully hidden longing for connection and meaning, and the kind of love that redeems all previous sorrows. In that moment, she understood that she had reached the point where refusal would require more courage than acceptance, where the greater risk lay in continuing to protect herself from the possibility of happiness. "Yes," she whispered, the word emerging like a prayer. "Yes, Edward. I will consider your proposal. I will risk everything with you if you promise to be patient with my fears and gentle with my trust." Rochester's smile was like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, transforming his entire countenance with joy so profound it made Eleanor's heart ache with its beauty. "I promise to spend every day earning your trust, Eleanor. I promise to build with you something worthy of the courage you are showing in accepting my love." When he kissed her, it was with the reverence of a man who had discovered treasure beyond his wildest hopes, and Eleanor found herself responding with the passionate relief of someone finally allowed to express feelings too long suppressed. In that kiss was the promise of redemption for both of them, the possibility that two wounded souls might indeed heal each other, that love might prove stronger than fear, that the careful walls they had built around their hearts might be transformed from barriers into foundations for something larger and more beautiful than either had dared to dream. As the winter morning gave way to afternoon, Eleanor and Edward talked with the intensity of people making up for months of careful restraint. They spoke of their fears and hopes, their past disappointments and future dreams, the way their separate wounds might become sources of strength rather than weakness when shared with someone who understood their origins. Eleanor learned that Edward's empire had been built not from greed, but from a desperate attempt to prove his worth after a youth marked by rejection and betrayal. That his isolation was a defense against the kind of pain that had once nearly destroyed him, that his hunger for her particular brand of honesty sprang from years of being surrounded by people who told him only what they thought he wanted to hear. Edward learned that Eleanor's strength had been forged in the crucible of watching her father die slowly of illness, of caring for her mother through the gradual erasure of memory and identity, of discovering that love sometimes meant accepting losses too profound for consolation, that her refusal to accept his help had sprung not from pride, but from the hard-won knowledge that independence was the only reliable source of security in a world that could strip away everything else without warning. Yet as they shared these stories, both began to understand that their individual strengths might be amplified rather than diminished by partnership, that the very experiences that had taught them to guard their hearts might also have prepared them to love with unusual depth and commitment. Over the following weeks, the penthouse underwent a transformation that reflected the change in their relationship. Where once it had been a monument to solitary achievement, it gradually became a home, warm with shared laughter, comfortable with the kind of casual intimacy that grows between two people learning to trust each other completely. Eleanor's mother's care was quietly secured through arrangements that allowed Eleanor to maintain her dignity while accepting Edward's assistance. The transition was managed with such delicacy that Eleanor could accept it as evidence of Edward's understanding rather than his wealth, his respect for her independence rather than his desire to solve her problems through financial power. Mrs. Fairfax, initially shocked by the development, gradually came to approve of the match, noting that both Eleanor and Edward seemed to have discovered reserves of happiness that neither had displayed during their careful months of professional distance. The older woman had seen enough of the world to recognize true compatibility when it emerged, and the way Eleanor and Edward complemented each other's strengths while gently addressing each other's weaknesses suggested a partnership built on genuine understanding rather than mere attraction. 6 months after that February morning, when their carefully maintained boundaries had finally crumbled, Edward proposed formally, offering Eleanor not just his love, but his partnership in reshaping the empire he had built into something that reflected their shared values of integrity and social responsibility. Eleanor accepted with the kind of joy that comes from discovering that one's deepest dreams are not only possible, but actively embraced by the person one loves most. Their wedding was a small affair, attended by Mrs. Fairfax and a few close friends, characterized by the kind of quiet happiness that speaks of decisions made with careful thought rather than impulsive passion. Eleanor wore a dress of simple elegance that complemented rather than competed with her natural grace, and Edward spoke his vows with the fervor of a man who had finally discovered the missing piece of his existence. In the years that followed, Eleanor and Edward built together exactly the kind of life both had secretly hoped for, but never dared to expect. The Thornfield Foundation became a model of corporate philanthropy, channeling the wealth Edward had accumulated into programs that provided education and opportunity for those facing the kind of circumstances that had once threatened to overwhelm Eleanor. Eleanor found in partnership with Edward not the loss of independence she had feared, but its transformation into something more complex and satisfying. The freedom that comes from being known completely and loved unconditionally, from having someone with whom to share both burdens and joys. She discovered that vulnerability, when offered to the right person at the right time, could indeed become a source of strength rather than weakness. Edward found in Eleanor the redemption he had sought without knowing its name, the understanding that achievement without connection was merely sophisticated emptiness, that love freely given and received was the only currency that truly mattered. Through her eyes, he learned to see his own worth not in terms of what he had accumulated, but in terms of what he could contribute to their shared life and to the broader human community. Together, they proved that two wounded souls could indeed heal each other, that love based on genuine understanding and mutual respect could transcend the circumstances that might have kept them apart, that the courage to be vulnerable could be rewarded with the kind of happiness that justified all previous suffering. The penthouse that had once been Edward's tower of isolation became their shared sanctuary, filled with the warmth of genuine partnership and the particular contentment that comes from having found in another person exactly what one most needed and least expected to discover. In its library, their children would later learn to love books and ideas, carrying forward the intellectual curiosity and moral courage that had first drawn their parents together. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the city lights twinkled beyond their windows like earthbound stars, Eleanor and Edward would remember that February morning when they had finally found the courage to admit what their hearts had known for months, that some risks are worth taking, that some boundaries are meant to be transcended, and that love, when it is real and true and grounded in genuine understanding, can indeed transform two carefully guarded souls into something larger and more beautiful than either could have imagined alone. In refusing Edward Rochester's initial advances, Eleanor had not avoided love, but had demanded that it meet her own high standards of integrity and respect. In accepting her refusal with grace and patience, Edward had proven himself worthy of the extraordinary woman who had dared to see past his wealth and authority to the man beneath. Together, they had discovered that the greatest luxury of all was not material comfort, but the freedom to be completely known and unconditionally loved. A treasure that no amount of money could purchase, but that two hearts, opened at exactly the right moment, could create together through the simple but revolutionary act of daring to trust each other completely. Their story became, in its quiet way, a testament to the transformative power of genuine connection, proof that when two people have the courage to see each other clearly and love what they see, they can indeed create something beautiful enough to justify all the risks such courage requires. In the end, Eleanor's refusal had not kept them apart, but had ensured that when they finally came together, it was as equals, as partners, as two souls who had chosen each other not from desperation, but from the deepest recognition of shared values and complementary strengths. And that, perhaps, was the greatest victory of all. Not that love had conquered their fears, but that their fears, when faced together with honesty and courage, had ultimately taught them how to love wisely and well.